As Anna mentioned, I'm going to present the findings from land use and waste. Now, these emissions contribute around 19% of Australia's national greenhouse gas inventory, and this section we've included three broad categories of emissions that are quite different. The first of all being forestry. Now, in the forestry, we've included emissions from deforestation and also sequestration from the plantation of forests. Cumulatively, on a net basis, these contribute about 10% of the emissions to this sector. Emissions from agriculture contribute 71% of emissions in this section and mostly come from gases produced by livestock. Gas use emissions from livestock are in fact about 50% of the emissions from this sector. Agricultural soils and the fire management of savannas also contribute to agricultural emissions. The emissions of waste contribute a further 13% of emissions in this sector and include the direct emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from landfills and commercial and domestic wastewater treatment. As you can see from this figure, between 2002-3 and 2010-11, which is the period of analysis for this section, emissions have actually fallen by 32% on a net basis. And this reduction is in contrast to other sectors of the economy where emissions have risen over this period. This reduction has also meant that Australia's emissions have not increased over the last decade, despite a significant increase in GDP during this time. Now, all categories investigated in this report contributed to these recent improvements. The largest contribution to these emissions reductions came from a reduction in deforestation, which decreased 45%, delivering emissions reductions of over 30 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Sequestration from new forestry also increased significantly from the plantation of new forest, delivering a further net emissions reduction of 13.5 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And emissions from waste and agriculture also decreased over this time. As you can see from this graph, the reduction in deforestation has been very significant. Emissions from deforestation fell between 2003 to 2011, and that was equivalent to about 5% of Australia's total emissions. In fact, 2003, which is the start date of this research, is actually a period of an unusually high low clearing rate when you look at the previous years and the subsequent 4 years. So the reduction has been particularly strong since 2006. There's been a 60 megatonne reduction since 2006, which is equivalent to approximately 80% of all emissions from brown coal generation in 2010-11. Much of this reduction occurred in Queensland, as you can see from the chart. And two factors are likely to have contributed to this reduction. First of all, tightening of regulations in Queensland through the Vegetation Management Act, and secondly, for the economic outlook for agricultural products during this time. Most land is cleared for agriculture, and so when agricultural commodity prices are low relative to the cost of production, the incentives to clear are reduced, and that was the case during this period. In terms of sequestration, as I mentioned before, sequestration rate increased quite strongly since 2003, although the rate of increase has reduced significantly, and the reason for that is because you can see on the graph on the slide. The increase in sequestration was driven by high levels of investment in plantation forests, particularly in managed investment schemes. This investment resulted in a significant increase in plantation that peaked in 2000. The rate reduced between 2000 and 2003, but after a recovery, fallen significantly since 2007 after the global financial crisis, when there were several highly publicised collapses of these investment companies. The area of new timber forest planted in 2012 slowed to just 3% of the total area planted at the peak in 2000, as you can see from this figure. And so the area planted in 2012 was actually less than the area cleared after harvesting. So in the past year, there's actually been a reduction in the total forestry area in Australia. Now in waste, you can see that over the time of the analysis period of this report, there was a 60% increase in abatement from captured waste gas. These abatement activities have become attractive investments as waste managers can earn revenue from the gas collected to be used as power generation. And most gas produced by wastewater and landfills is methane, which is a major component of natural gas and can be substituted quite easily. Other sources of revenue include renewable energy certificates if this generation is connected to the grid, and in some cases carbon revenue can also contribute to the business case. Now, the increase in capacity from the generation of these fuels has actually been quite significant, and landfill and wastewater generation is now capable of powering over 200,000 homes. In agriculture, abatement itself has been limited to date, although there have been significant reductions in some areas, particularly in piggery methane management. The methane from piggery manure can be captured and used for power generation in a similar manner to landfills. Improvement in the management of the fire regimes in northern savanna regions has also resulted in some abatement. The improved management of these savannas draws on traditional Indigenous knowledge of fire in the landscape, which reduced the severity of late season fires. The improved fire management regimes have also been shown to have biodiversity benefits, and the revenues from these projects through carbon offsets can also boost the local economy for these communities. These abatement activities have been relatively minor influences to date on overall emissions, with the majority of the overall reduction that I mentioned earlier coming as a result of a reduction in livestock numbers that mainly occurred from a reduction in sheep up until the end of the drought in 2009. Now, looking forward in this sector, despite significant recent reductions in emissions from land use and waste, the outlook is unfortunately not as positive for much of this sector. There's been no significant projects identified to reduce deforestation, and further sequestration from carbon forestry is expected to be limited to less than 1 megatonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. The outlook for abatement in waste is more positive. So current trends of abatement would lead to about 3.5 megatonnes of abatement in landfills and wastewater gases, which is actually greater than the opportunity that we identified 3 years ago in our low carbon growth plan research. So in terms of deforestation, without significant abatement projects from reducing deforestation, emissions from clearing are at risk of increasing significantly. Regulations to limit the clearing that contributed to much of the decrease over the last decade have recently been relaxed in some states, including Queensland. Avoided deforestation is now eligible for the Carbon Farming Initiative, which may lead to an increase in projects after the approval of the methodology very recently. Although these will require a strong financial incentive, as there is an opportunity cost associated with reduced deforestation. The outlook is not much better for sequestration from the plantation of forestry, where a reduction in investment in plantation forestry has already significantly reduced the rate of new plantings. Much of the area planted during the boom in investment from management investment schemes is also at risk of being cleared. Pulpwood forests, which were the preferred planting during this period, are generally planted on a rotation of 10 to 20 years, and so a large proportion of these areas is now due for harvest over the next decade. This harvest will reduce the overall carbon balance of these forests, and many areas may not be replanted as plantations deemed commercially unviable are not replanted after they are harvested due to the lack of further ongoing investment. The rate of conversion from forest to other land uses expected to increase over the next 5 to 10 years. Plantation re-establishment remains unviable. And this is illustrated by the reduction in the baseline sequestration of forests used by the government in this chart here, which shows a reduction from over 25 to around the order of 5 megatonnes of abatement per year. Still on forests. There was an increase in forests planted specifically for carbon sequestration in the last 2 years as these forests had become eligible for the CFI. continuing this trend would lead to abatement in the order of 1 megatonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is quite small compared to the expected reduction in sequestration from forestry, and falls well short of the abatement that we've identified in the low carbon growth plan research. I guess the reluctance of investment comes from the fact that these forests are very long-term assets, and they have significant upfront investments from planting, and are difficult to make the business case when there is an uncertain revenue stream from carbon pricing. Forest management, or the reduction of logging in native forests, is also a new activity that will be included in the emissions inventories in subsequent years. There has been a reduction in logging from native forests in the past decade, although it's difficult to gauge the size of these influences given the data that's available. Current trends in wastewater management are far more positive, I mentioned earlier, and would lead to a 48% increase in abatement from this sector. The increase is expected to be particularly strong in wastewater, where abatement is expected to reach 60% of total emissions by 2020, and this corresponds to what is considered best practice in the industry today. There's also a strong pipeline of projects, so projects in the assessment or development phase, that could increase capacity for generation by 35%. Some abatement from agriculture has been identified, although this would only capture a small potential of the abatement that we've identified in our research. The majority of the abatement from this sector is expected to come from revegetation of rangeland areas, where over 875,000 hectares of rangeland is expected to be managed for improved sequestration based on current trends. Abatement of 0.8 megatonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent is also expected from improved fire management in Northern Australia. Abatement of methane from livestock manure is expected to contribute as well, with greatest adoption coming from intensive piggeries, where abatement should cover 30% of Australia's pigs by 2020. The adoption of soil cultivation practices such as reduced tillage have also continued to be adopted throughout the last decade, and these activities have been shown to reduce the emissions from soils. These emissions will also be included in Australia's inventory from subsequent years, although the data on historical emissions is not available at a granular level at this stage. So as we can see from the changes from the first column to the second column, in previous decades emissions have reduced by about 50 megatonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is the reason that Australia has maintained a steady emissions profile during this time. Although in this sector emissions would grow by 41% if no abatement activity occurred, and this increase would be driven by the reduction of sequestration in forests that would be harvested, and then some of which would not be replanted. If recent trends in abatement are sustained, then 8 megatonnes of abatement would be delivered, which would bring down emissions growth to 35%. So increased deforestation remains a significant risk, and this is due to the legislative changes and also the macroeconomic outlook. And these, of course, could lead to either an increase in these emissions in the future. So despite some improvements in many areas, much of the identified abatement is likely to remain uncaptured under current trends, as we can see from this chart. The majority of this uncaptured potential is likely to be in forestry, where abatement activity to date has been low and overall sequestration is likely to reduce. Waste have been one of the most promising areas covered by this research, with more abatement expected to come under common trends than what has been identified in our research. I guess the reason for the slow uptake of this activity can be explained in part by our cost curves that we've produced in previous research. This is the cost curve that's for the land sector activities alone. Anna Skarbek showed the full economy cost curve, which showed quite a large portion of abatement that could be achieved at zero cost. That's abatement that comes with productivity or energy savings benefits. In this sector, as we can see, most of the abatement opportunity lies above the zero cost line. So that is, it requires some sort of carbon pricing signal to be incentivised. The biggest part of this is from reforestation and environmental forests, which I've pointed out there. This comes at an average cost of about $25 per tonne. As I mentioned, these are long-term assets that require a stable outlook carbon price at this level to be incentivised at a large scale. Reduced deforestation and natural grassland management, which are also the two significant abatement opportunities, also come at a relatively moderate cost. And that's because of the opportunity costs associated with using that land. So the key findings from this report are that emissions from land use and waste reduced significantly over the last decade, with a reduction in emissions of 32% offsetting emissions growth from all other sectors of the economy. The future, however, is not as positive, with emissions expected to rise to 2020 through reduced sequestration as the managed investment schemes plantations are harvested and some will not be replanted. It's also a significant risk of an increase in the land clearing rate, which could further increase emissions. There are many opportunities to reduce emissions in this sector, though, and there is the potential for, identified for further 93 megatonnes of abatement in this sector that was identified in the low carbon growth plan. Unfortunately, this abatement is unlikely to be captured under current trends, and we would need a further incentive, such as a carbon price or other mechanism, to incentivise this activity.